Welcome everyone to our Zoom tonight from the Marion Public Library and from Bloomington, Indiana. And this is a program that has been actually 24 months in the making. We applied for a grant at the end of 2019 and we received it. And we were going to have Janine in person. We were going to have Janine on Zoom. And with COVID hitting, we just kept postponing and postponing. And we're finally doing it, and we're very, very excited. This is part of Indiana Humanities Novel Conversation Group grant. And Janine comes to us. She's a clinical assistant professor of history at Indiana University, and she specializes in both U.S. labor and U.S. religious history. She has a book coming out called War for the Soul of the Christian Nation, Christianity and American Socialism, 1880 to 1920. And that'll be published in 2022. And when she's not teaching or writing, she leads IU's dual enrollment program in U.S. history, and is lucky enough to partner with more than 80 high school teachers in Indiana and surrounding states in bringing college-level U.S. history to high schools. And I know that in Marion, we have our high schools a participant in that program. And I'm not sure if Oak Hill is. Travis would know. But anyway, this is just totally exciting, and we're glad that you're all here. And would you please welcome Janine?
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining me today. I am going to share my screen, and I hope this will work, to tell the story of women's suffrage in Indiana, sort of a new story of women's suffrage in Indiana. So I had many titles for this talk, but I'm going to go with the Other Suffragettes, Rethinking Our Narratives in the History of Women's Suffrage, or the importance of socialist feminists in the state of Indiana. Sorry, I'm going to manage this here. So most stories of women's suffrage in the United States begin with Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Carrie Chapman Catt, and the many others who called themselves suffragettes. As the story goes, they were abolitionists and they wanted to see women win suffrage in the 15th Amendment, ratified after the Civil War. When they learned that neither Republicans nor Democrats would get behind that idea, they launched themselves into the women's suffrage movement. However, when you look at the story of women's suffrage on a smaller scale, say in Indiana in particular, the narrative of women's suffrage in the United States shifts significantly. Nationally known suffragettes like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton fade to the background or the periphery of our story, and the story becomes different. It has different major actors and really different turning points. So today I'm going to tell two overlapping stories of women's suffrage in the state of Indiana. And then I'm going to reflect on why we need both of them and how they suggest a different overall narrative. The first story I'm going to tell is the story of white, primarily upper class women, many of whom were, like these women, former abolitionists and leaders in their churches and communities. That story, the story of upper class women in Indiana, is largely a story of failure when it comes to women's suffrage. That is, women's suffrage is never passed in the state of Indiana as a piece of legislation at the state level. I mean, it is passed, it is passed very, very briefly. It is rendered unconstitutional almost immediately, and it is never passed permanently again until the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Then I'm going to tell a different story, the story of working class women, including women of color in the state of Indiana, and how they came to support the women's suffrage movement in the late 19th and early 20th century. And as I'll explain, it was the working class women, and particularly socialist feminist leaders in our state, who built the infrastructure to drive the statewide campaign to press the state to ratify that 19th Amendment. So that first story. Just a few years after the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 in upstate New York, the state of Indiana passed a new constitution in 1851. And the Indiana Women's Suffrage Association was founded right after that passage of that new constitution in protest of the fact that this new constitution did not support women's suffrage or did not delineate any support for women's suffrage. Amanda Way was founding vice president of the organization, and she was an abolitionist and an active member. Sorry, I'm going to move my camera here so I'm looking right at you. She was an abolitionist and an active member of the Underground Railroad. She was trained as a teacher, but when the cholera epidemic took the life of her fiance in 1849, she became a nurse. She never married, but she studied theology. She became an Episcopal minister, then she became a Quaker leader. She was one of the leaders who who built this Women's Suffrage Association and passed it on to the next generation. Another leader at the time was Mary Olive Thomas of North Manchester, Indiana. She was not even able to make the convention in person, but she wrote, "Although a wife, mother, and housekeeper with all that means, I am studying medicine and expect to practice. If I live, I will become a doctor." She urged women to enter the trades and professions to fit themselves in some ways for pecuniary independence. That year, the Indiana Women's Suffrage Association elevated women's pay, women's ownership of property, women's rights to vote, and women's education as their highest priorities. The IWSA soon became the main vehicle through which middle-class and elite women built suffrage organizations or built consciousness raising for the sake of getting white women or white educated women the right to vote. And they were successful. They were successful in building a coalition that was able to be passed on to another generation of women after them. Helen Guger, for example, was born in Lafayette, Indiana, and went to Hillsdale College. She went on to work in Lafayette's public school system and soon became a school principal. In early 1894, Guger joined a mass action of women who showed up at the polls and demanded their rights to vote under the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. The federal Constitution, after all, didn't say that women could not vote. And this was a large conversation at the time, that maybe women should just show up and say, the federal Constitution does allow women the right to vote through the 15th Amendment, 14th and 15th Amendment, why can't they? So she was leading this effort in the state of Indiana. And she was very proud to be a white person with a lot of education and with the leadership over the school. Of course, the registrar refused to allow her to vote, so she sued Tippecanoe County in Indiana and eventually argued the case herself, representing herself before the Indiana State Supreme Court. She lost, as we're not surprised to hear. The state Supreme Court held that whatever her personal views were on suffrage, the state constitution did not allow her the right to vote. And the only remedy the court held was to actually amend the Indiana state constitution. So the Indiana Women's Suffrage Association spends the next several decades working to amend the Indiana state constitution, because they find from this particular court case that that is their only or their most effective means toward getting the women the right to vote in the state of Indiana. If we foreground the story of the Indiana Women's Suffrage Association in our history of women's suffrage, our narrative is honestly a story of failure. It's a story of indignant white women and their lobbying efforts that ultimately meet with frustration. And I'll tell you a little bit more about why. In 1917, when the IWSA is getting very close to passing the Maston-McKinley Partial Suffrage Act, in the United States, there are a whole lot of states in the West. The white ones here are the states that have full women's suffrage. So here we're looking at Canadian provinces that have women's suffrage, and also the Western states of the United States, which have full women's suffrage. And the ones that are color black here do not have women's suffrage. And you might notice some patterns here. In 1917, when the IWSA is pressing for the right to vote, they're asking for Indiana to basically join these Western states in expanding this suffrage to all people, or to all to white women at least. And at that moment, many of Indiana's foremost business leaders stood with the South. They sort of identified with this Democratic coalition in the South that is against the expansion of suffrage. And they sued the state. So the Maston-McKinley Partial Suffrage Act is passed in 1917, and immediately Indiana's business leaders sue the state in saying that that act is actually unconstitutional under the Indiana Constitution. And so for a very short amount of time, in 1917, there's an estimate of 30,000 women in Indiana who did register to vote and who did even express that right to vote. But immediately these court cases, there were two of them in quick succession, brought by two Hoosier men, Henry Bennett, a lawyer and president of the Indianapolis Stove Company, and William Knight, a lumber company owner. Both of these court cases together sealed the fate of women's rights, or women's rights to vote in the state. The state of Indiana held that it was unconstitutional to allow women the right to vote in a constitutional convention to decide whether or not women could have the right to vote. And so it was very frustrating to the IWSA, who thought that this piece of legislation was the thing that they've been working on forever. But the state Supreme Court, so this court case went all the way to the state Supreme Court, and they said that it is unconstitutional for women to have the right to vote in the state of Indiana. And that was a huge source of frustration for women's suffrage organizations, who had really been spending the last 30 years in Indiana just trying to amend the Constitution or to make a constitutional convention to amend the Constitution. So this story of women's suffrage, of the people who called themselves suffragette activists, is interestingly a story of utter frustration and failure, because they were never able to actually get this done at the state level. So now I'm going to turn to why it is that in 1919, suddenly, just 2 years later, the state of Indiana ratifies the constitutional amendment to allow women the right to vote. What happens in the interim? Why is it that something is so unsuccessful 2 years earlier, and so much more successful in 1919? And to tell that story, I think we need to back up, go back to 1851 and the state constitution 1851, and think about the many other players in the national discussion and the local and statewide discussion on suffrage in the state of Indiana. So let's go back to 1851. In 1851, why is there a new constitution passed in 1851? Like, let's begin to ask ourselves that question. In 1851, or actually in the early 1800s, Indiana was part of the Northwest Territory, land set apart to be free territory from the 1790s. It was well situated on the Wabash and Ohio rivers, and soon connected with the east via the Erie Canal. This meant that in the early 1800s, both Black and white farmers could earn a prosperous living by sending their goods to market by road, river, or railroad. Indiana was a really good place to be a farmer. In the early 19th century, our state was home to hundreds of settlements of free African Americans. And this picture that you're looking at is from the book by Annalisa Cox called Bone and Sinew of the Land. And she drew this map. Each one of these little circles represents at least one African American owned farm, no larger than 199 acres. And what this illustrates is very boldly, of course, these are the states in the Midwest, which illustrates how many African Americans had settled in this territory in the early 1800s. This is a large number of people. This is free territory, and there are a lot of Black pioneers. We all use this word pioneer very in quotes these days, because pioneer can mean a lot of different things, but sometimes we use the term refugees. But there are a lot of African Americans who are settling on this territory before it is settled with a lot of non-Indigenous people. And in the early 1800s, this is a free territory that's really important for a lot of people, and a really good land, as I said. So in the early 1800s, there are a lot of African Americans. However, and we should also mention that there are cities that are growing, but they're really not that big in the early 1800s either. The major crop, the major economic sources of income in the state of Indiana are really hog farming and corn. This is not a very urban place yet. However, more and more white farmers are recognizing by the 1850s that this is really valuable land, and they're in a country that is having lots of discussions, as we know, on the expansion of slavery, on where can slavery expand to, where can people bring their slaves. As you know, this comes up in, the Dred Scott decision. And there are a lot of people from the South who are coming into, or, from Kentucky, for example, who are coming into Indiana and bringing with them a lot of more Southern cultural norms and lots of discussions on what are the rights of African Americans to their own property and to the right to vote. In 1851, the Indiana Constitution is rewritten with attention to the fact that a lot of white people in the state of Indiana don't want Black people to have to continue to settle the state and to have the rights to vote and to have the rights to land. So if you look at the 1851 Constitution, you notice a lot of some really important things. Of course, it begins with the sort of things that you might expect. All men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. This is something that we're familiar with, right? And that all the people have the right to, alter and reform their government, and that's supposedly why they rewrote this Constitution in 1851. However, let's look at Article 2. Every white male citizen of the United States with a certain age, and every white male of foreign birth with 1-year residency can become a citizen and have the right to vote. As of 1851, there are lots of efforts not only to drive African Americans out of the state through violence, but also to make it illegal for African Americans to have the right to vote. Now, I've heard lots of things since I put this together about how this may or may not have been fully enforced in all voting precincts, and that's important. But it's also important to recognize that there are a lot of people at the Indiana Constitutional Convention who are interested in dialing back African Americans' rights to vote in 1851 in order to get more white people to settle and the people who are white to be able to take over that land, the valuable land that African American families had been living on for a long time and entitled to. It's also important to note that in this Indiana Constitution of 1851, they note that no, and this is in quotes, no Negro or mulatto shall have the right of suffrage, directly stated in 1851. Now, if we think about this, we might have to, once we recognize this, we might have to think back on why is it that the Indiana Women's Suffrage Association, founded in 1851, is not drawing attention to the fact that Black women can't vote and that Black people in general don't have the right to own property at all. That might make us rethink, to what extent was that Indiana Women's Suffrage Association really a suffrage association, and to what extent was it really about promoting the opportunities for white women to exercise more leadership and control over society? And I ask this as questions, but really as questions that I think we all should be thinking about. The Indiana Constitution also notes in Article 13 that no, this is in quotes, no Negro or mulatto shall come into or settle in the state after the adoption of this Constitution. Yes, Indiana is technically a northern state, but this is 1851 in Indiana, and there are already prohibitions on popular sovereignty for African American settlers. No selling property to African Americans means that white people who are trying to sell their land to Black people have to face fines. And so lots of people are implicated in this new provision in the law. So Indiana, of course, becomes a state that's more and more associated with the South, both because of the migratory patterns of white settlers from the South, and the ways that African Americans are being driven out of the state through violence of many forms in this time. However, the Civil War, of course, happens, and momentarily the northern states and the Union has more power, technically the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments get passed, and African Americans should have full civil rights under the federal Constitution. However, there are lots of efforts to not empower African Americans in the state of Indiana in the late 19th and early 20th century. Lots of efforts to take back any possibilities of African Americans having the right to vote granted in the federal Constitution. And I'm going to tell you about those in just a second. However, what's interesting to note before we even get to that, is to note how many white people in the state of Indiana in the late 1900s are really frustrated with the Democratic Party, which is sort of centered in the South in the late 19th century, and the Republican Party, which is really a party of big business in the late 19th century. And there are a lot of white farmers in Indiana who are feeling like neither of these major parties are representing their interests as farmers, as people who are sort of are now, because of the railroads, there's a possibility of going all different places cheaply, but it's also that they're facing a lot more competition with other farmers who do have similar stuff to sell all over the place. So late 19th century, there are more and more socialists in the state of Indiana, people who are looking for a different party, a third party, to represent the interests of small farmers and small business owners. And that's a really interesting and I think important history in our state that we might not really actually talk about enough. This is partly because there's lots of German influence, and there are a lot of German socialists in Germany and in the United States, or wherever Germans go at that time. It's also because Indiana is in the center of the Midwest, and there are a lot of Midwestern farmers who are really struggling in the late 19th century. But we do know that by the late 1890s, Indiana is sort of ground zero for socialism in the United States. And when I say that in person, usually people laugh, but I think it's true. Indiana was at the crossroads of the populist and the socialist movement, and they saw themselves in the late 1900s as aiming to protect small farmers from losing their livelihoods. The Coming Nation, a national magazine for farmers interested in what they called agrarian socialism, was first incorporated in Greensburg, Indiana, and became one of America's first socialist newspapers. In 1894, the same year that Helen Gugger sued Tippecanoe County, Eugene Debs successfully defended the Pullman strike from his hometown of Terre Haute and galvanized support for even more Americans to consider cooperative enterprise. Indiana was very soon really the center of socialist organizing in the United States. And so there are a lot of names for this developing socialist party under the leadership of Eugene Debs. It's called Social Democracy. It's called the Social Democratic Party. It's later called the Socialist Party of America. It's really all the same thing. They keep renaming themselves. And so I'm going to sort of refer them in general as the socialists because they have many names. But in 1894, the Social Democratic Party is founded in Indiana. They are dedicated to, at first they have lots of discussions on whether or not they're going to pursue political action, which is voting people into office, or they're going to actually build small settlements, small cooperative communities, and make that sort of an example for how the world should operate better. They do both at the same time, and they fight over which one is better. But they're really trying to build a third party in the state of Indiana and across the United States, a third party that really represents the interests of common people. And what's most important to me about all this, and for our purposes right now, is that foremost in their agenda in 1898, foremost in their agenda is revision of our antiquated federal constitution in order to remove the obstacles to full and complete control of the government by all people, irrespective of sex. In other words, foremost in their priorities in 1898, set in Indiana, Indianapolis, they continually have their conventions in Indianapolis, is universal suffrage. And the socialists say that the only way that working people, regular ordinary people, are going to have any political power in the state of Indiana is by demanding universal suffrage, and that the limitation of suffrage to white men who are wealthy, basically, or of course, technically all white men have the right to vote in 1898, but a lot of immigrants and working people of all different types, or African Americans, are not having the right to vote. The Socialist Party says that the only way that working people are going to have political power is by universal suffrage, and they become the party of universal suffrage, and they're growing, honestly, at a faster rate than any women's suffrage association. And if you think about who they're fighting against, this becomes a little bit more clear, or perhaps more explainable, right? About why socialists are the leading, party, leading working people's party in the late 19th century. For example, who is in leadership in the state of Indiana in the late 19th century? For example, Charles Fairbanks. He was a senator, and then he was vice president under Teddy Roosevelt. When Eugene Debs is defending the railroad workers and becoming a national figure in support of unions, collective bargaining rights, and the Pullman strike and thereafter, Charles Fairbanks literally says, I represent the railroads, and I represent the right of any railroad company to get an injunction against your right to strike, because he says that, you know, he supports business owners. So of course, this is a real, the injunction is a real problem for labor. And the Democratic Party is really in favor of limiting suffrage. They're, you know, the Southern Party that's against, that it's basically in favor of white supremacy. So these two political parties make it really hard for them to even claim that they represent any working people. But that also means that the Socialist Party has a lot of room to declare that they need an expanded electorate, that they really need an expanded electorate. The KKK is growing in prominence in Indiana at this time. For reasons that many of you have probably heard before, because there are a lot of Democrats, because a lot of people have affinity with the white supremacist governments of the South, and because the KKK is really also against Catholics, and there are a growing number of Catholics in the state at the time as well. Meanwhile, the Socialist Party, again convening in Indiana, is growing with numbers of African Americans in attendance. And I found two African Americans who spoke from the podium in 1901 and were really part of the central deliberations of the party in terms of what are their priorities in 1901. And I can tell you a little bit more about them, you know, in the Q&A, but I think it's important to recognize that the Socialist Party is really in favor of universal suffrage over and over and over again as they meet. It's continually part of the priorities of the party. They are going to use the ballot in defense of their own interests by voting the socialist ticket, meaning the Socialist Party, as they're emphasizing, as they turn away from the idea of focusing on small communal experiments and cooperatives of that type, they entirely in support of the labor movement, but they're also trying to build an effort to get more people registered to vote and get more people have the right to vote, so that the Socialist Party can have leadership within Congress and within state governments. This is a strategy, a socialist strategy that's being used all over Europe at the time, and the American Socialist Party thinks that they should use that strategy as well. And it's important to note that African Americans are, the Socialist Party is endorsing the rights of African Americans to vote in the state of Indiana at this time, when I can't find any evidence that in 1901 any white women's suffrage association is making that claim of support. It's important to note in 1903, if you just look at some newspapers and how they're discussing the expansion of suffrage and discussions on suffrage, you find tons of articles like this one from Terre Haute in 1903. Claims that this is, in quotes, has Negro suffrage failed? Argument, yes, Negro suffrage has failed. And the implication here is that African Americans had been voting in the Reconstruction South, and they created utter chaos. And therefore, just as Southern states were enacting all sorts of provisions to keep Black people from voting, Indiana should follow suit and do the same thing. And in this particular article, the author is suggesting that the United States should buy northern Mexico for African Americans, give them grants of land and cattle, and entice resettlement. This is just in the pages of an ordinary newspaper in Terre Haute. And it suggests for us that in the state of Indiana, there's lots of discussions on limiting the right to vote, not expanding it. This article came from the Indianapolis Recorder, the African-American newspaper in 1904, where the African-American author here says, "We believe the large majority of the voters of the North, as well as the South, are weary of Negro suffrage. They're convinced it was a mistake, that it's injurious to our country. Certainly, there are very few who believe that Negro domination ought to be forced in any state." The Indianapolis Recorder is suggesting, I think we should have a conversation about this. And this seems like a radical idea, that there should be a conversation, a public conversation on the extent to which Black people should have the right to vote. Again, according to the federal Constitution, in 1904, Black people have the right to vote. But in the state of Indiana, there are lots of discussions on how Black people really should not have the right to vote. And certainly, few discussions on how Black women should have the right to vote, who I even say outside of actually the leadership of the Black women's organizations in the state. After reading all this, I looked to see if in the state of Indiana, our lawmakers in the state assembly ever seriously discussed repealing Black voting rights. And I was looking through all of the journal of the state assembly, and I found this from 1905. The protection of the franchise. I'm going to read this to you. Foremost among these, I place the preservation of the elective franchise from pollution. I believe I speak for the vast majority of the people. This is an elected official in the state assembly register. When I say that the time has come for the application of drastic remedial measures to the plague of corruption, which is fastening itself upon our politics to an extent appalling to those who look forward to the ultimate in the sort of progress that has been made along these lines in recent years. Reading this took my breath away, because it seems like a very thinly veiled statement of why African Americans and women as a group should not have the right to vote. And this is the Journal of the State Assembly just illustrates that they are having this discussion, even if they're not officially passing a law saying that Black people can't vote. They're certainly resistant to the expansion of the electorate. In the meantime, though, this means that socialists are growing in size and in representation among the electorate in Indiana and across the country, because as the Democratic Party and the Republican Party refuse to really budge on expanding the electorate, the Socialist Party is becoming more and more popular. So this is a map that I commissioned a graduate student here at IU to make me, based on a list I had of socialist officials who were elected to public office as of 1912. The Socialist Party is growing and growing by 1912. It's growing in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. The Socialist Party is growing in popularity. It is popular among people who identify as Christian socialists, who see Christianity and socialism sort of working together. It's popular among a lot of German immigrants who, again, are just part of an international orbit of German socialist literature. And it's popular among a lot of other people, including African Americans, who just want to see the electorate expanded, who want to see all working people have the right to be represented in public office. As the Socialist Party grows, the Socialist Party creates more and more bureaus, more and more divisions or departments in order to get out the vote, in order to expand, the number of people who are registered. Because their plan here is to get more people to register with the party, and then hope to take those party cards and pressure Congress to allow all of these people on these cards the right to actually vote in any public election. So the Socialist Party builds a women's bureau in 1912, and this is a national, basically a department of the Socialist Party. And the Women's Bureau has a state department that reports back to the National Bureau. And in Indiana, we have a pretty well-developed Women's Bureau of the Socialist Party. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. Their priorities are, as of 1912, mothers' pensions, education for women, and basically the politicization of working women. That's how I would sort of put it together. As one woman put it, the socialist woman cannot run the risk, like her capitalist sister, centering her thoughts only on her own development and advancement, a petty individualist view. She must know that first and foremost, she is responsible to society for the young. So in all different ways, both by politicizing motherhood and politicizing housewifery, and the Women's Bureau is trying to organize both working women who have wage earning jobs, and women who are working in childcare or domestic work, which is bordering and various things, and politicizing those women to help them see themselves as as economic actors and political actors. And I note this little, you probably can't read it, but this graphic on the right, this excerpt that I took a picture of on the right, says, "Let us make this point clear." I'm just pointing to this part here. "Our work is not to form separate organizations for women. The Women's National Committee has never favored a separate organization. And they go on to explain that part of their mission is also to get men used to women being in charge. And so they say, this is a women's bureau, but our goal is actually just to build a Socialist Party because we want men to get comfortable in a world where women are just as political as they are. They sponsor, the Women's Bureau was so interesting to me. So I wrote this book on socialism in the United States, and this is just a small part of it, but it was really interesting for me to note that this Progressive Woman, this socialist women's newspaper of the early 20th century, is more popular than any other socialist newspaper or magazine in the United States. So if you think of the Socialist Party and you don't think of women, you're actually probably not, you're not thinking of the majority. There are more subscribers to this socialist women's magazine than there are to any other socialist organ in the United States. And the Progressive Woman is fantastic. A lot of it is scanned. You can read it all day if you have a day off. It's really, really interesting and fun to read. And here's one example. 1913, an article by the editor. It's just sort of representative example. Does a woman support her husband's employer? And the article's point is, women, you should recognize your husband works to produce saleable goods for the man who employs him. You work to keep a home and feed your husband so that he can keep on working to produce saleable goods for the man who employs him. In other words, you are an economic actor, and you should be a political actor too, because you are part of the economy, even if it doesn't always feel that way. By the late 19-teens, there are tons of women who are working in the Indiana Socialist, in the Women's Bureau in the state of Indiana. So I'll tell you a little bit about a few more of them. I realize that we're at 35 minutes, but I want to tell you a little bit more about these people because they're so interesting to me. And some of them are from your area. So Lilith Martin, Lilith Martin, born in Dublin, Indiana, married in Anderson, Indiana, was the woman's state correspondent. So she was sort of in charge of the whole operation in Indiana in 1912. She would go on to become a state-level administrator in the Socialist Party in Indiana, and in the 1930s, she was elected to public office. Under her leadership, the Indiana Women's Bureau collected between 3,000 and 5,000 signatures from the state of Indiana for the purposes of amending the federal constitution. So she is collecting a ton of signatures, men and women, to put pressure on the state to ratify the 19th Amendment. She is not interested in pushing for, amending the state constitution in the state of Indiana. She's interested in she and the Women's Bureau are really working on a national goal. She takes those signatures and she brings them to Victor Berger. Victor Berger is the only socialist elected to Congress. He's from Wisconsin. And she has Berger, the Wisconsin representative, bring these to Congress because he is representing all these socialists, many of them are from Indiana, as people who are demanding the right to vote. Martin worked closely with Rosa Lenhart, whose orbit in the campaign, her focus was on equal suffrage and equal pay. And she's located in Indianapolis and in charge of all the stump speakers in Indianapolis, the women's stump speakers in Indianapolis. When she got started in this work in 1912, she was 35 years old. She had 2 children, ages 4 and 6. And she referred to herself as a woman wage slave or slave of a slave. Of course, she's referring to the ways that women are, were identified as lower because of their domestic work. And she identified with all of these women who are seamstresses, button makers, chemical workers, and housewives. So I looked up what are the types of jobs of people in the state of Indiana, of working women in the state of Indiana. We should know that according to our own state statistics, as of 1919, there are 12,300 women who are working outside the home in the state of Indiana. They're working, the largest number is in metal products. They're working in textiles and drugs, of course, for Eli Lilly. More than 2,000 in textiles, 1,000 in food products, and 1,000 in drugs. There are more who are not on this list, who worked as nannies, who worked in laundry, who worked in cooking, who took in boarders. And socialists emphasized that all these women shared in common the oppressive expectations of being a subservient helpmeet in the household. And they're trying to change the whole culture by setting up organizations where women are leaders and men listen to them and they work together on an equal playing field. The Socialist Party still by 1912 recognizes that women's suffrage is absolutely central to their goals. So by the accounting of Lenhart, there were 300 Socialist Party women registered as of 1912 in the state of Indiana. And she said she claimed that this was larger than the number of any other women registered for any other political party. So she makes the claim that that socialist feminists or the socialist suffragettes are actually a larger political voting bloc than any other socialist or any other suffragette group in the state of Indiana. And it's an interesting story. In 1920, she gets the right to vote and she immediately gets divorced, which is interesting in the way that she's told her own story. Finally, this is the last person I'm going to focus on, and then I'm going to conclude. Florence Waddles found, I haven't seen her published by anyone else, so I feel like I found her, and she's been so fun to get to know. She was born in Elwood, Indiana, to parents who were Quakers and Christian Socialists. Her father was active in the Socialist Party. She ran as a Socialist candidate for Congress in the 8th Congressional District in Indiana, and she was a Socialist candidate for county attorney in Madison County in 1910. So I'm going to skip ahead a little bit on her biography, although I could talk about her for a long time. And very interestingly, in 1913, so she was in her 20s. She was speaking in Angola, Elkhart, Mishawaka, South Bend, Michigan City, LaPorte, East Chicago, Indiana Harbor, and Attica. She was selected to be Indiana's delegate to the Socialist Party National Committee. So she was a woman, but it didn't matter. She was elected to the National Committee of Socialists between 1912 and 1915. And then she went on to be a chief organizer for the Socialists in the whole state of Indiana. She worked with the United Mine Workers in the state of Indiana to get the mine workers to be in support of women's suffrage. And she, as the story of women's suffrage, as in Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony's History of Women's Suffrage, their authoritative volume on how women's suffrage got passed in the state of Indiana, they say it was Florence Waddles who worked with the miners in Kokomo and who was invited to speak before the convention of the United Mine Workers. In 1915, she convinced the United Mine Workers to sign a unanimous resolution favoring state and national women's suffrage. And she got 1,600 delegates there to put pressure on the state to ratify the constitutional amendment. So she got the whole labor movement, or not the whole labor movement, but a large fraction of organized workers in the state of Indiana to support women's suffrage in the state. And it was really, what I want us to emphasize here is, it was really the Socialist Party, the Women's Bureau, and the collaboration among all of these many organizations in the state of Indiana. And I should mention there are Black women's organizations too. There are apparently 28 separate suffrage organizations that together put pressure on the state of Indiana to ratify the amendment. So I'm not suggesting that this is the only story that we should tell, but Florence Waddles and these many women in the Women's Bureau put pressure on the union movement to support women's suffrage. And once they do, the state of Indiana approves in the 19th Amendment. And I think this is an interesting story for a lot of reasons. Usually when we tell the story of women's suffrage, we emphasize that this cross-class collaboration has to happen in order to get women's suffrage passed nationally. And usually we tell the story, for example, in New York and in California, of the Women's Trade Union League that becomes the hub of working women working with wealthy women. And they're defining what is feminism, and this is, for example, a famous broadside that defines what is feminism. And we sometimes talk about the colored women's clubs, which are really important, especially here in Indiana, because they're interested in Black women's visibility and their economic, moral, and religious welfare in all different ways, protecting and empowering their children and their communities. But women's suffrage is definitely on that list, even if it's not the the only thing on that list. So I want us to recognize that there are many, the only way that women's suffrage is achieved in the state is through the coalition building of these many different organizations. But we do need to recognize that in the state of Indiana, the Socialist Party is leading a lot of this coalition building work in the 19-teens. It's because the Socialist Party has a very long history in the state, and it's because Debs is very famously from Indiana. But it's also because we have a lot of socialist women who put a lot of effort into building this Women's Bureau and building coalition within that sphere. So thank you so much for the opportunity to share all this with you. I would love to talk about anything in our Q&A.
If anyone has any questions, do you want to put them in the chat and I'll read them? So I have a question, Janine. What happened to the Socialist Party? Did they become something else? I mean, did they tend to become more Democrat or more Republican? And when did that happen?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, during World War I, there's a lot of suppression of socialism because, as you might know, if you're into the history of Eugene Debs, for example, Eugene Debs says that the World War I is really a capitalist war, and he encourages people to not cooperate with the draft. And then he goes to jail for encouraging people to not cooperate with the draft. And then he runs for president from jail. But in general, there's a lot of suppression of socialists during World War I. Basically, Woodrow Wilson, through his Sedition Act and through the efforts of the Red Scare during World War I, make it illegal to practice as a socialist, to print stuff about socialism, to talk about socialism in certain places. So socialism gets suppressed. And there are a lot of people who still believe those things. And we know that because during the Great Depression and in the 1930s, we see lots of socialist discussions, and some of these people really learned these ideas 20 years earlier. But the World War I and the 1920s build a new set of national discussions that disempower socialists from public life. So, I guess that's a short answer. My other answer that I write about in my book is that the social gospel movement, the leader of ministers in the United States, was sort of entertaining some of these ideas that socialists are discussing in the 19-teens, and then by 1920 are very much against anything that sounds socialist. And so once socialists lose their allies among middle class and middling class peoples, it becomes less defensible. It becomes harder and harder for working people to celebrate those ideas and pass on those ideas and discuss those ideas publicly.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else have a question? Oh, can you see that?
Yes, I can. So the question is, you mentioned one suffragette who got divorced, but were most suffragettes single, or did they have husbands who are on board? That's a good question. And that's not something that I studied in my own research personally. But what I know from other people's research is that there were both. There were women who, among the wealthier suffragettes, a lot of these people are married women who already, as I mentioned at the beginning, who already sort of have power because they have professions and they often have ways to make money, or they have inherited wealth, or they're married to someone who has a lot of money. And they're just absolutely indignant that they don't have the right to vote, and yet they can be well educated and leaders in other ways. So a lot of those people are married. And then there are women who are really upset with the whole system of marriage and the way that system of marriage is so patriarchal and so unfair to women within the institution of marriage. And so a lot of feminists of this moment are trying to defend the rights of married women, the rights of married women to their own property, to have their own inheritances, to have the right to vote, to have the right to get divorced too, especially as they're talking about in cases of abuse and neglect and other forms of mistreatment. So they're both. And there are, of course, also women who are independent, who don't get married or who want to be in partnerships with women, which, are queer in general, like may or may not be sexual, but there are a lot of women who are in relationships with women who are either sexually involved or best friends, but a lot of feminists at this moment are rebelling against the institution of marriage to men.
That's interesting. Anyone else? That was very, very interesting. And we thank you for bringing it to us tonight.
Oh, thank you so much. And if you don't mind, I might ask you if I could have a copy of the recording too, but thank you so much. I appreciate this.
I will. And thank you all those who attended, and hopefully we'll see you again sometime, Janine.
Thank you. I would love to. I would love to come up and see you someday. Have a great night.
See you later. Bye, everyone.